welcome. Be sure to like and subscribe for more scary stories, or I will come for you. I'd like to thank Dagol and the Chill Girl for rejoining the Curator's disciples. Your viewership is very much appreciated. If anyone would like early access to my latest stories and an ad-free listening experience, consider becoming one of the Curator's disciples. The link is in the description below. Today's story, Hell's Exchange, by the Curator. I've always hated the smell of damp. It's a scent that clings to your skin and soaks into your bones, reminding you of things you'd rather forget. The smell takes me back to my childhood home. The peeling wallpaper that looked like it was fighting to stay attached to the walls. The sagging ceiling stained with watermarks that bled down in streaks like the house was slowly bleeding out. Black mold crept up the corners of every room, sending a sickly greenish-black shudder through the air. The house was old, practically crumbling, but it was the only thing my parents could afford. I used to joke that if you slammed the front door too hard, the whole place would fall down like a deck of cards. My dad never laughed at that. He couldn't afford to laugh. My dad worked at the local mill, pulling double shifts, his calloused hands covered in oil and sawdust just to keep food on the table. It wasn't enough. It never was. My mom worked just as hard, taking in sewing jobs from the neighbors, hemming pants, patching shirts, creating curtains for people who could afford them. I'd watch her work late into the night, her back hunched, her fingers stained with ink and thread. Even with both of them working themselves to exhaustion, we barely made ends meet. I remember one winter when the heating broke. My mom bundled me up in every blanket we owned to keep me warm. I could feel the cold creeping in through the walls and floors, but the blankets helped, just barely. My dad kept apologizing, saying he'd fix it next week, but next week never came. He was always too tired, or too broke, or both. I was just a kid, but even then, I understood the weight of poverty. I could feel it in the way my parents' shoulders sagged as if the world was pressing down on them, in the whispered arguments they'd have late at night when they thought I was asleep. It was in the tight smiles they wore when they pretended everything was fine, as though they were trying to convince themselves more than anyone else. The worst part was seeing my mom skip meals, claiming she wasn't hungry, so there'd be enough for me. I'd sneak her portions back onto her plate when she wasn't looking, but she always noticed and gave me a look that made my chest ache. A look that said, "I'm fine, don't worry about me." But I did worry. I worried every time she smiled, that weak, sad smile, knowing she was sacrificing something she shouldn't have to for me. School wasn't much better. I was the kid with thrift store clothes, duct-taped shoes, and a lunchbox filled with stale bread and peanut butter that stuck to the roof of my mouth. The other kids, the ones with their shiny backpacks, their expensive sneakers, their brand name everything, never let me forget it. They called me Discount Alex, like I was some bargain bin knockoff of a real person. I'd laugh it off, but deep down, it stung more than they could ever know. I'd watch them trade Pokemon cards, talk about their family vacations to Disney World, and I'd feel this burning envy that made my stomach churn. When I turned 16, I got my first job at a local diner, washing dishes. It was grimy, back-breaking work, the kind of job that made your hands ache and your back scream after a long shift. But the paycheck felt like a lifeline, a glimmer of hope in the fog. I thought I'd finally be able to help my parents, maybe even save up for college. But life had other plans. My dad's health started to decline. His lungs, worn down from years of breathing in mill dust, gave out on him. He started coughing up blood at night, but he'd shrug it off like it was nothing, as if the mill was the only thing keeping him alive. The medical bills piled up faster than we could pay them, no matter how many hours he worked or how many jobs my mom took. Whatever I earned went straight into the black hole of our debt, and it still wasn't enough. By the time I graduated high school, college felt like a pipe dream. I enrolled anyway, fueled by sheer stubbornness and the misguided belief that I could somehow outrun my circumstances. I signed up for student loans, knowing they'd follow me like a shadow, but I told myself it'd be worth it. Student loans didn't magically cover everything, though. Part-time jobs barely paid for textbooks. I'd spend nights in the library, not studying but scrolling through forums about how to get rich quick. Most of it was nonsense. Pyramid schemes, fake investment tips, or just outright scams. But I kept looking, desperate for a way out. I didn't want to live like this anymore. I didn't want to be stuck in the cycle of poverty, watching everyone else glide through life, leaving me behind. After college, things didn't get any better. The debt followed me like a shadow, growing heavier with every missed payment. I'd watch my friends post pictures of their new cars, their fancy apartments, their weekend trips to wine country, and I'd feel this gnawing resentment, like an acid eating away at my insides. I was stuck in a dead-end job, barely scraping by, while they were out living their best lives. It wasn't fair. I had done everything right, worked hard, stayed out of trouble, and still, life felt like one long punishment. That's when the anger started, not just at the system or the circumstances, but at the people who seemed to glide through life without a care. The ones who didn't have to choose between groceries and rent, who never had to feel the sting of an overdraft fee or the humiliation of borrowing money from friends. I didn't just want to escape my situation. I wanted to shove it in their smug, privileged faces. I wanted to be the one posting pictures of a penthouse view, sipping champagne on a yacht, living in a world where money solved everything. I wanted to matter. But dreams don't pay the bills. And as the years dragged on, I started to give up on the idea of ever being anything more than what I was, broke, bitter, and invisible. Until that night. It was late, and I was in one of my doom-scrolling spirals, clicking through random forums to distract myself from the crushing weight of my life. I was tired. My eyes were sore from staring at the screen for hours, but I couldn't stop. I didn't want to stop. That's when I saw it. A thread titled, "Hell's Exchange. Don't click if you value your life." The title alone was enough to pique my curiosity. It sounded like one of those urban legends or creepypasta stories, the kind of thing you read for a cheap thrill before laughing it off. I was in no mood to laugh, but something inside me compelled me to click. The post itself was a mess of warnings, random words that seemed to contradict each other, and cryptic messages. Some users claimed it was a scam, while others swore it was real. There was a thread full of terrified comments, begging for the link, as though the idea of what lay behind the screen was worse than not knowing. And then, buried at the bottom, someone had posted it, a simple hyperlink with the words, "Click at your own risk." I stared at it for a long time, my finger hovering over the mouse. Every instinct screamed at me to close the tab, to forget I'd ever seen it. But curiosity, or maybe desperation, won out. I clicked. The screen went black. At first, I thought my laptop had crashed. I tapped the keys, trying to bring it back to life, but nothing happened. The quiet stretched, the kind of silence that fills a room with more weight than sound ever could. Then, red text appeared, glowing like embers in the darkness. Anything you desire can be yours for a small price. My heart pounded as I read the words, each one feeling like a slap in the face. The room felt colder, the air heavy with something I couldn't name, something that felt wrong. My fingers trembled as I moved the cursor over the single red button beneath the text. It read, "Agree." I hesitated. This had to be a prank, right? Some elaborate hoax, or a virus waiting to wreck my computer. But then I thought about my life, the debt, the dead-end job, the endless cycle of struggle. What if it wasn't a joke? What if this was my one shot at something better? Before I could talk myself out of it, I clicked. The moment I did, the screen erupted into static. My laptop whirred like it was overheating, and whispers filled the room. They were faint at first, like wind through cracks in a window, but they grew louder, more distinct. I couldn't make out the words, but they sent a chill down my spine. Then, as suddenly as it started, everything went quiet. The screen cleared, and he appeared. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. The air seemed to ripple, like heat waves rising from asphalt. Then the shadows coalesced, forming a figure that stepped out of the darkness. He was tall and impossibly thin, dressed in a black suit that shimmered like oil. His skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched taut over sharp, angular features. But it was his eyes that froze me in place. They weren't eyes at all, but voids. Twin black holes that swallowed everything in their gaze. He smiled, and I felt it in the pit of my stomach. It wasn't a friendly smile. It wasn't a comforting one. It was the kind of smile that says, "I know everything about you, and I will own you." "Welcome, Alex," he said, his voice low, like gravel scraping against stone. "You've made your choice. Now, let's discuss what you desire." I don't even remember telling him my name. It was like my body was on autopilot, every part of me trembling as if I wasn't in control. My throat felt like it was coated in sandpaper, dry and scratchy. I struggled to swallow, but the words just came out, almost against my will, as though something or someone else was speaking through me. "I want to be rich. Filthy fucking rich." The moment I said it, I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, like the universe itself was recoiling at my request. My hands shook uncontrollably as I gripped the edge of the desk, my palms slick with sweat. I wanted to take it back. I wanted to scream no, but the words were already out there, hanging in the air like a curse. The figure before me didn't react right away. Instead, his lips curled upward, a smile spreading slowly across his face. It wasn't a smile of kindness or understanding. It was cold, predatory, as though he had just been waiting for me to say those words. His teeth gleamed in the dim light, sharp and unnaturally white, each one elongated like a predator's fangs. His smile deepened, stretching beyond what should have been humanly possible, until it seemed as though his face itself was warping to fit the twisted grin. "Done," he said, his voice smooth like dark velvet. But there was an edge to it, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. As he spoke, he snapped his fingers, and the sound of the snap wasn't normal. It didn't echo like a simple motion. No, it sounded like a gunshot, a sharp, deafening crack that rang in the stillness of the room, shaking the walls around me. The sound vibrated deep inside my bones, rattling my skull as if something inside me had just been broken open. And then, just as abruptly as it had started, the figure's smile vanished. His form flickered like an old film reel, sputtering, and within seconds, he was gone, leaving nothing behind but a palpable silence. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, thick and oppressive, like the room had suddenly been vacuum sealed. My laptop blinked out of existence in an instant, the screen going black as if it had never been on in the first place. The hum of electricity, the glow of the screen, the oppressive feeling of his presence, all of it disappeared, leaving me alone in the dark. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart thudding loudly in my chest, like it was trying to escape from my ribcage. What had just happened? Did I really do that? I sat there, in the pitch-black room, paralyzed by the weight of the moment. My mind raced, spinning in a frantic blur, but I couldn't make sense of it. What price had he meant? What had I just agreed to? It was as if the world around me had shifted, just for a second, into something darker, something far more dangerous. The reality of the situation started to sink in, but it was too late. The deal had already been made. For a few minutes, I sat frozen in my chair, staring at the black screen of my laptop. The room was eerily quiet. No hum of the fan, no distant traffic noise, just an oppressive silence that wrapped around me like a suffocating shroud. I replayed the events that had just unfolded. Who or what had I just spoken to? And had I really sold my soul for a promise, a fleeting taste of something I could never truly own? The rational part of me desperately tried to dismiss it as some elaborate prank or a fluke of my mind. Maybe I'd fallen asleep at my desk and dreamed it all, the bizarre encounter with that thing. But as I sat there, with nothing but the haunting black screen in front of me, a gnawing feeling crawled up my spine. Something wasn't right. I glanced down at my hands, which were trembling uncontrollably. At first, I thought it was just the adrenaline kicking in, but then I realized the air around them felt hot, like I'd been sitting too close to a fire. I could feel the heat radiating from my palms, the skin prickling as if it were burning from the inside. As I turned my hands over, I noticed faint red marks across my skin, resembling the impressions of something hot pressed too long against me. It was as though my very touch had left scorch marks on myself, like I had been holding something smoldering, but there was nothing there. This was no dream. Before I could fully process what had happened, the sound of my phone buzzing on the desk shattered the silence. I jumped so violently that the chair scraped across the floor. My breath was shallow, my hands slick with sweat, but I forced myself to reach for the phone. The screen lit up with an unfamiliar number. Hesitantly, I picked it up, my fingers icy as I swiped to answer. "Hello." My voice cracked, sounding like a stranger to me. "Mr. Carter," came a smooth, professional voice, chillingly calm. "This is Jonathan Hayes from Fidelity Investments. I'm calling to inform you that your account has been credited with a recent inheritance. Are you available to verify some details?" I blinked, disoriented. "Inheritance? I think you've got the wrong person," I stammered, my throat dry, fighting to swallow the rising lump in my chest. "I assure you, sir, there's no mistake," the man said, his voice unfazed, too smooth, too polished. "Your great-aunt Eleanor Carter passed away recently and left her estate to you. We've already processed the funds into your account. Would you like to check your balance now?" I stared at the phone, my mind a mess of confusion. I didn't even know I had a great-aunt Eleanor, but the man didn't give me a chance to question it. Before I could speak, he rattled off an account number that matched the one I had used for my near-empty savings account. My throat tightened. He was right. It was mine. How could this be? He guided me through the steps of logging into my banking app. My fingers were numb, but somehow I managed to tap the correct keys, still numb with disbelief. When the balance finally appeared, my breath caught in my throat, my vision narrowing as my heart skipped a beat. $5 million. It was as if the world had suddenly stopped spinning. My body went cold, the blood draining from my face. The zeros on the screen blurred together as I stared, unblinking. I didn't even know how to breathe. It wasn't just money, it was freedom. No more dead-end jobs. No more scraping by. No more agonizing over every bill. It was everything I had ever dreamed of. Everything I had ever felt was out of reach. "Mr. Carter?" Jonathan's voice cut through the haze, pulling me from my daze. "Is everything all right?" I tried to respond, but my throat was tight and my voice came out ragged. Yeah, I managed to stammer, my pulse hammering in my ears. "Thanks for letting me know." I hung up, still staring at the screen, my hands shaking as I gripped the phone tightly. The numbers blurred, the weight of what I'd just seen pressing down on me, suffocating me. It felt too good to be true. It was too good to be true. My mind swirled, trying to find an explanation. A coincidence? A mistake? Or had this somehow been part of the bargain? Then I remembered. The voice. The thing. Everything comes at a price. I shook my head, trying to push the thought away, but it clung to me, relentless and cold. Maybe this was just a fluke, a coincidence. Maybe this inheritance was just delayed paperwork, and the timing had been a twist of fate. But deep down, I knew better. This was him, the thing in the shadows, the one who had promised me everything, the one who had given me everything. The first few weeks after that night were a dizzying blur. I paid off every debt, cleared every bill, and still had enough to live a life I could have only imagined. I bought a sleek, new apartment in the heart of the city, filled it with the finest furniture, and threw myself into a world of luxuries I had never dreamed of. Designer suits, private chefs, fine wine flowing like rivers. I even bought a black sports car that turned heads wherever I went. People who had once ignored me now bent over backward to gain my attention, their smiles wide and eager, their voices dripping with flattery. I felt untouchable. For the first time in my life, I felt like I mattered. But the high didn't last. It started with the nightmares. Every night, he appeared, the man in the black suit, standing at the foot of my bed, his eyes like endless pits, dark, hollow, and empty. He never spoke, just watched, his presence suffocating. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest, my hands trembling as I scanned the room, certain he was standing just out of sight. The feeling never left, even after I woke. It clung to me, making my skin crawl, as though his eyes were always on me, no matter where I went. Then came the whispers. At first, I thought they were just remnants of the nightmares, but they started happening during the day. I'd be alone in my apartment, the city buzzing outside, but within the walls, the air would thicken. I'd hear faint murmurs, low and guttural, coming from nowhere. It was as if the very walls were alive, their voices filled with malice, making my skin crawl. Sometimes, they sounded almost like laughter, cruel and mocking. Others like a chant, like something ancient and malevolent was waiting just beyond my reach. I couldn't escape them. The whispers followed me everywhere. In the shower, in the car, even in the crowded streets. There was no escape. The final straw came when I got a call from my mom. She sounded frantic, her voice shaking with fear. "Alex, it's your dad," she gasped, nearly choking on her words. "He's in the hospital. They found something wrong with his lungs, tumors or something. The doctors don't know if he'll make it." I felt like the floor had dropped out beneath me, and everything spun. My dad, the man who had been the pillar of my life, the tough, unbreakable figure who had worked until his hands bled was sick. His life, his strength, had been stolen from him. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could see was the image of him, fading away. I booked a flight home that night. I couldn't sit in my opulent apartment any longer, surrounded by the fruits of my twisted bargain. I needed to see my dad, to do something, anything to make it right. When I arrived at the hospital, I barely recognized him. My father, the man who had once been indestructible, now looked frail, his skin pale and drawn tight over bones that jutted out at unnatural angles. The machines surrounding him beeped softly, their sterile hum a painful reminder of how much time he had left. His body was a hollow shell, his strength gone. Tubes snaked from his arms and nose, connecting him to the machines that kept him alive. He looked at me weakly, his lips cracked from dehydration, but he managed to smile. "It's good to see you, kid," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. I forced a smile back, my throat tight with unshed tears. "You too, Dad." The doctors were blunt. There was nothing they could do. The cancer had spread too far. It was too late. The best they could offer was palliative care, a cruel, bitter joke. My mother cried, her hands gripping mine like I was her only anchor. But even as I held her, a gnawing fear twisted in my gut. That night, as I sat by my father's bedside, the whispers came back, louder this time, echoing through my head like 1,000 voices murmuring in unison. A price must be paid. I gritted my teeth, trying to block them out, but they only grew louder, more insistent. My chest tightened, my breathing shallow as the room grew colder. And then I heard it. "Alex," the voice whispered, smooth and cold, like a knife being drawn across bone. "What are you willing to sacrifice to save him?" I froze, my blood running cold. The room felt darker, the air thick with malevolent energy. I turned, but no one was there. "Leave me alone," I hiss under my breath, my hands clenching into fists. But the voice didn't stop. "You wanted to matter, Alex. You wanted wealth, power, freedom. Now, it's time to pay the toll." My heart thudded in my chest. Was this why my dad was dying? Had I traded his life for mine? The weight of it crushed me, but it wasn't enough to silence the voice. I couldn't escape it. "Fine," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Take me instead. Just leave him out of this." The voice laughed, a low, menacing chuckle that sent a shiver down my spine. "Oh, Alex, it's never that simple." The days bled into each other as I spiraled deeper into madness, tortured by the whispers and haunted by the figure in the black suit. My choices had led me here, to this moment. I had given everything for a life that wasn't truly mine. And now, my father's life would be the price. I didn't know how much more I could take. It felt like time had stopped, the days blending together in a blur of dread and suffocating guilt. Each whisper, each eerie voice, wrapped around me like chains. It was like I was slowly suffocating under the weight of my own choices, and the voices kept repeating in my mind, echoing off the walls of my skull, growing louder with each passing second. "You wanted power," it mocked. "You wanted wealth. You wanted to be more than you were. Now, everything must be paid in full." The whispers, the laughter, the cold presence. It was becoming unbearable. I couldn't escape it, couldn't outrun the consequences of my greed. The price was now unavoidable, and I could feel it coming for me, like a wave that was too large to escape. One evening, after another sleepless night tormented by visions of the man in the black suit, I found myself standing at the edge of my father's hospital bed, my hands shaking, my face pale and drenched in sweat. The life I had dreamed of, the life I had stolen, was unraveling before my eyes, and all I could do was watch. Suddenly, the air shifted. The room seemed to darken, and I felt it again. His presence, as cold as ice, wrapping around me. His voice slithered into my thoughts, smooth and venomous. "You think this will save him, Alex? The cost is already paid. And now it's your turn." I tried to ignore the voice, to focus on my dad, but it was impossible. The sound of laughter, that sickening, hollow laugh, filled the space, reverberating against the sterile walls. It was like the laughter came from everywhere, inside my head, inside my soul. And then my father's breathing stopped. Just like that. He went still, and the machines beeped in a sudden, haunting way. The color drained from his face, and I felt my heart break in a way I never thought possible. I wanted to scream, to beg, to do something, anything, but I was frozen, trapped in my own remorse, in the tightening grip of the bargain I had made. Then it happened. The shadows in the room seemed to warp, bending unnaturally, swirling around my father's bed. I could feel them press against me, pushing into my chest, tightening around my throat. The voice was louder now, like a thunderclap in my ears, filling my mind with despair. You wanted wealth. You wanted freedom. You wanted to matter. Now, you'll see the cost of those desires. I stumbled back, gasping for air as the darkness seemed to take form in the center of the room. There was a strange, unnatural heat filling the air, like a furnace was being stoked behind me, and I couldn't look away from the shadows. They began to twist, forming into the tall, impossibly thin figure that I had seen before. His black suit gleamed in the dim light, and his void-like eyes pierced through me, devouring my soul with a gaze that made my skin crawl. He stepped forward, his smile a razor-sharp grin. You thought you could escape the price, Alex, but it's always waiting for you. It was always meant to be this way. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I couldn't escape him, couldn't escape the horrific reality that I had sold my soul. And now, there was no going back. There was only the toll to be paid. He extended a hand toward me, and I felt my chest constrict. My breath caught, and before I could scream, his hand pressed against my chest. It was cold, colder than anything I had ever felt, colder than death itself. A sharp pain shot through me as if every organ in my body was being crushed at once. I dropped to my knees, gasping for breath, my body racked with pain. I could feel the blood draining from my face, my skin burning as if it were being seared by fire. The pain twisted and contorted my body. My muscles spasmed, and I felt my bones crack, stretching unnaturally. I screamed, but the sound was muffled, like I was underwater, like my body was no longer my own. I tried to move, tried to escape, but it felt as though the very ground beneath me was swallowing me whole. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air, my body aching in ways I couldn't comprehend. My chest burned, my limbs felt heavy and alien, and when I dared to touch my face, I froze. My hands, trembling uncontrollably, found jagged scars where my smooth skin had once been. My face, once familiar, was now unrecognizable. The skin was raw, stretched tight over my bones. It felt like a mask, a hideous, grotesque mockery of the person I had once been. My fingers touched the hollowed-out areas of my cheeks, the gaping, blackened sockets where my eyes had been. I tried to scream, but the sound came out a hoarse rasp, a distorted croak that didn't sound human. My reflection in the hospital window was a nightmare, a monster staring back at me. His voice was the last thing I heard as he vanished into the shadows. It echoed in my mind, low and mocking. You wanted it all, Alex. Now, look at what you've become. I couldn't stop shaking. I tried to lift myself off the floor, but my disfigured body barely responded. My fingers were like claws. My legs wobbled beneath me. I looked down at my father's still body, the man who had given everything for me, the man who had been the only thing in my life that mattered. And now, I was alone. The days bled into each other as I wandered, broken, a shell of the person I had been. The world had turned its back on me. People recoiled at the sight of my disfigurement, as if my very presence was an affront to everything they valued. I had lost everything, my family, my wealth, my humanity. I was left with nothing but pain, regret, and a body that felt like it belonged to someone else. The whispers never stopped. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear his voice, mocking, condemning, reminding me of the deal I had made. But there was one thing I couldn't escape: the temptation, the cursed website. The link still existed, buried somewhere in the recesses of the dark web. And even though I knew, deep down, that I could never go back, the pull was always there. The temptation to click that button, to make one last deal, to escape this torment, gnawed at me like a disease. One night, as I sat alone in a decrepit motel room, my fingers hovered above my phone, my trembling hand almost touching the screen. My mind screamed at me to stop, to resist, but the temptation, the promise of an escape, was too great. I knew better. I knew that if I clicked, there would be no coming back. I had already paid the price, but the darkness whispered that there could be more, that I could have it all back again if I just made one more trade. But I fought it. With shaking hands, I slowly pulled away from the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned the phone off, throwing it aside. I could hear the whispers fading, but I knew they would always be there. The temptation would always be there, and I would never escape. This is a cautionary tale, a living warning of the price of greed. My body, my life, my soul, forever marked by my mistakes. People whispered about me, called me a fool, a lost soul, and they were right. I had been consumed by the darkness, and now I was trapped in it. And as I sat in that lonely, forsaken room, staring at the cursed website one last time, I knew I would never escape its pull. The temptation would always haunt me, a shadow that would never leave. And no matter how hard I tried, I would never be free. I had already paid the price. This is the Curator. I hope you've enjoyed today's scary story. Until next time.